So, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. As in your introduction, it was mentioned that you wrote the book on manufacturing. It's kind of appropriate. We're in the Hamilton Hotel, who had the original American manufacturing policy. And I guess we wanted to talk a bit about the 21st century version of that. And Megan is a constituent. She's a Silicon Valley constituent and has a lot of practical and academic and policy experience in this. And I like to approach it from the policy perspective. But I guess my opening question to you is that we just heard Senator Rubio talk about how we can respond to Made in China 2025 and recreate a manufacturing and innovation ecosystem in the United States. And you have a lot of experience in interacting with venture capitalists, high technology CEOs, where kind of the mentality has been, we can design it here, but we're going to make it somewhere else. How can we change that?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Sridhar for the invitation and your leadership in the Obama administration. And I appreciate this consortium and forum on manufacturing experts and looking forward to the conversation. My book's a little dated. In 2012, I think we were at parity almost with China in manufacturing when I wrote it. And so I was looking at it before coming here, and I said, wow, those statistics are already out of date. The story hasn't been that positive in terms of the aggregate manufacturing statistics since 2012. I would say a couple of things. First, in Silicon Valley, the prototype manufacturing is still done in the United States, right? So Apple would never go outsource its prototype manufacturing given IP concerns. The question then is, what type of manufacturing can be done here, and how can we have certain types of manufacturing at scale? And what are the types of manufacturing that can be done where we have a competitive advantage? I would argue that there are four areas that we would. The most urgent, which I think Jumpstarting America, the book by the two MIT professors, Simon Johnson and John Gruber, outlines, is having a lead in the future industries, in manufacturing of robotics and synthetic biology and photonics and the key industries of the future. You'll note in Silicon Valley, I mean, Silicon Valley was created basically because Shockley, the Nobel laureate, wanted to move to Palo Alto. Does anyone know why he picked to move to Palo Alto? Yes. His mother lived there, exactly. You know, it's a really good point because most people live 18 miles away from their mother, 18 miles in America. So this idea that everyone should just move to new jobs is fairly unrealistic with the actual way we live. And most people, when you go out to different communities, they want the jobs to come to them. Anyway, Shockley moves out there. Bell Labs was funded, 25% of Bell Labs research was funded by the federal government, 25%. And almost 85% of electronics research when Shockley is developing Fairchild and then, of course, Intel. At that point, almost 85% of electronics research is funded by the U.S. government. So we have in the past, in the recent past, you don't have to go all the way back to Hamilton, we have in the recent past funded new industries and new research. In fact, post-Sputnik, 1957, we had a response saying if the Soviets were going to put a satellite in space, we weren't going to be left behind. And research and development was about 2% of GDP, almost 2.5%. It's now 0.7% of GDP. We at that time said, let all the engineers and scientists into this country. So my parents came here. Now we have a much different attitude towards immigration. We mobilized the private sector with universities and the federal government in leading the 21st century. So my view is that really should be the blueprint for the 21st century. It almost sounds cliched unless you look at our current politics and say, wow, it's amazing that what worked in the past is something that we're unwilling to replicate going forward.
So I really enjoyed how you were talking about jobs coming to the people as opposed to people moving for the jobs. Now, you are the unofficial ambassador of Silicon Valley, and I think my colleague Joe is able to put up a picture from one of your bus tours. I found this on the internet. You took 15 venture capitalists from Silicon Valley for a tour of the comeback cities in the Midwest. And encouraging them to invest beyond the Bay Area. The capital venture investment in the Bay Area is about 45% of the investment. You add Boston to that, that's the vast majority of VC funding in this country. And one of the VCs afterwards wrote, along with this article, these comeback cities have what we're missing in Silicon Valley, problems to solve that are more representative at American and possibly global markets. 8 months after you led this group of venture capitalists, there was the initiative of a fund, $2.25 million fund, to support startups in the Midwest, which I think is really exciting. So congratulations. Can you tell us more about how advanced technology and manufacturing can move forward with all Americans in mind and spread the investments and the job opportunities around the country? I really like how you've already thought very expansively about how to do this beyond kind of the traditional powers of Congress, legislation, and oversight, looking at things like bus tours. But can you tell us more there?
Well, I appreciate that. Tim Ryan, Congressman from Youngstown, was a key figure in leading that as well, and so I just want to give him appropriate credit. The reality is we do have a concentration of venture capital, but I think before we can see technology hubs or technology jobs across the country, we also need the concentration of what sparks high-tech job creation. I mean, you can't just have investment without the ecosystem. And I think there are two different degrees. One is, what can we do to create a high-tech manufacturing hubs across America? The secondary question is, what are opportunities for people, including in rural communities, to participate in the high-tech economy? Not everyone has to be a high-tech hub to have a basic technology job in the middle class and to have upward mobility. And so on the first instance, I think the work that Sridhar is doing, the work that Jumpstarting America articulated, which is looking at 100, 150 cities across America, mid-sized cities, also including mid-sized cities, and making strategic investments in new industries that are consistent with that regional talent, and having a university and the private sector involved is critical. I'll tell you that to do that, it requires a lot of regional leadership. It can't just come from Silicon Valley or from Washington. You need a regional partner. In Jumpstarting America, Orlando is seen as this great success story where they're creating naval simulation for planes or flight simulation in Orlando. It was a defense hub, and then the University of Orlando invested in it, and you had federal investment and private sector investment. Now they have almost 35,000 jobs there. For every PhD research scientist, the lab has 10 other jobs that don't require even college degrees. So this idea of manufacturing, advanced manufacturing being a multiplier is proven, and not just economically, but anecdotally. And when you look at the different industries that we can invest in, there's no reason that many of our cities and mid-level cities can't be manufacturing hubs. I think we need two different points to it. First, we need more strategic federal investment in these initiatives. We haven't had that federal investment. And then, Senator Peters is going to be here talking about a National Manufacturing Institute and his idea that we have some consolidation at the department, and some authority to go to the president. So we have some consolidated, coordinated response. Now, look, Jeff Zients was talking about this in the Obama administration when I got there in 2009. And when I got to Congress, probably there was no progress in 10 years. And that's because I realized this when I realized how did we determine how to staff commerce agencies. And a friend of mine and I won't mention his name, did this whole analysis of where the rate of return was good. And we went to speak to someone higher up at the Commerce Department, and they just started laughing. They said the way we staff depends on who the ranking member and the chairman on the relevant committees are. This is silly, all of the analysis. So we have to figure out how we get beyond just politics too. I mean, the Congress has been the biggest obstacle, candidly, in terms of restructuring. It's not the administrations, the Congress and the turf war, and members of Congress wanting to keep their own jurisdiction. But I think we need these regional hubs in manufacturing. And second, I think rural can participate in a lot of these tech jobs. We've had great success in Jefferson, Iowa. That's not a huge manufacturing hub, but we've partnered with Des Moines Community College, Accenture, Microsoft, and some of these tech communities in a rural town of 5,000 people to create 25, 30 jobs, paying 50, 60, 70,000 for folks who are going to do basic software architect design. Robotics processing administration is another area where we're going to see a lot of tech jobs, and they can be located anywhere.
So yeah, I appreciated those insights. It reminds me why we need two moderators to keep up with you, because you have a lot of experience and depth in this. Two questions come to mind. I'll ask one right now. There is and I think you talked about some of the policies that we once had that we've gotten away from with respect to R&D, investment, immigration, a lot of investing in workers, a lot of that. So do you think there's also a mindset in the country that views industrial policy as something that is un-American? Because I'm setting this question up as because obviously China has Made in China 2025. Its whole economy is built around a state plan to make stuff. Germany has a different model. Japan, Korea. In fact, if you look at most successful, industrial nations around the world, they have a very distinct kind of industrial manufacturing policy. You support a presidential candidate who I think wants to get us there as well. But what do you think are some of the impediments or the opportunities that you see as we move ahead?
Right. Well, first of all, look, I think China is a serious rival, but I wouldn't want to copy China. I mean, China.
Well, correct.
They're they've got, first of all, starting out, they've got 1 million Uyghurs in jail, and they have very little regard for civil liberties, and they probably are overspending on things that are totally inefficient, and they've got authoritarian capitalism. So do they pose a challenge to the United States? Yes, just out of their sheer size. I mean, the Soviets at the height of the Cold War, I think, were a third of our economy and didn't surpass our population. China is going to be 4 times our population, so just by definition, they're going to have a large economy. But I think when you talk to people in Silicon Valley, they'll tell you that the most innovative entrepreneurial folks in artificial intelligence and in synthetic biology and in photonics still want to be in the United States. I mean, they still want to be in the United States. I think 15 of the top 20 universities are in the United States. What's mind-boggling is that we're trying to signal that we don't want them here. I spoke to Condoleezza Rice. We don't agree on a lot of foreign policy. She said if she were running the United States, she'd do 2 things. She would double the National Science Foundation budget, double all the science foundation budgets, the NIH, DARPA, the funding for advanced technology, and she would want every smart person in this country. And those were to be her 2 policies to try to succeed in the 21st century. And I think that, I don't think that has to be industrial. When you talk about industrial policy, I think people have this vision of, it's just going to be the government there picking winners and losers. I think what the United States model has been entrepreneurial, with the federal government funding discontinuous innovation. In other words, innovation that's large bets that may not commercialize, and then the private sector and universities working in cooperation to take that technology and commercialize it. And one place we probably want to have more focus is on the transitional funding of things that they go from academic papers into actual production, and to have more emphasis on it. But our strength is that partnership, that symbiotic relationship between the private sector, the government, and and universities, research universities, and local governments. You know, one advantage America has, and you know, my Congress is inept, but in certain ways, but we've got actually very good local government. We've got a lot of people who run for city council and mayors and regional boards and regional universities who have a great autonomy. You know, my constituents often come to me and they say, can you tell Mayor so-and-so to do X? I say, I'm happy to send him a note. It's about what will guarantee that she or he won't do it. You know, the local leadership is very strong. And so I've described this as sort of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. I think where the government has gotten away is that we perhaps aren't as, we're more complacent. You know, in the Cold War, we had a great challenge. And so there was a mobilization effort. And I think post the Cold War, we've perhaps been more complacent about our lead in the 21st century. And we need to re-energize in making sure that we have a lead in the future industries.
That's interesting. One of the things that some of my neighbors and I were talking about after Senator Rubio spoke was an interesting framing that he had regarding Made in China 2025, where as opposed to saying, you know, we need to directly compete with this, like this is a benchmark that we need to directly compete with, as I understood his remarks, it was almost like Made in China 2025 is an important benchmark that we need to keep track of, but America needs to know our own inherent value and what we're bringing to the table, which I thought was really interesting. So, I mean, pushing a little bit more on this topic of industrial policy versus, you know, as we've coined it, innovation policy that America has been practicing, you know, how can we compete? And how should we be competing with these countries where there is, you know, state-owned enterprises, state-owned venture capital funding that is investing in hardware startups, not just in their own country, but in America as well? How do we think about competing and protecting our intellectual property moving forward in this new reality?
Well, I'll answer your question about the protection of intellectual property, but I think that's one part of the issue. I mean, if you talk to Apple Computers or Tim Cook, they'll tell you that their biggest intellectual property is their culture. I mean, you can copy a lot of their things, but you're not going to replicate Apple, or you're not going to replicate Google, and they're years ahead in terms of the cultural, all that goes into having a risk-taking, innovative culture. My view, and you know, I was trying to had the great honor of meeting a month ago President Carter, and I said to President Carter, I said, do you know the last time China was in a war? And he said, Ro, I know, I normalized relations with China in 1979, and that's the last time they were in war. We've been in war 40 times. President Trump and President Carter actually had a call, and they agreed about this. $6 trillion later. I mean, imagine if we had put that money in high-speed internet, if we had put that money in making sure every American has access to fiber, if we had invented and put money on 5G instead of letting Ericsson and Nokia and Huawei take the lead, if we had put some of that money into these manufacturing institutes across the United States, or making our college more affordable, and apprenticeship institutes across America. So I would argue, I don't think the focus has to be on just intellectual property, though that's important. I mean, I think it's important to look at some of the Huawei's, it concerns me, and I think having appropriate sanctions there, it makes sense, and I think having appropriate sanctions on Chinese interference in places where they require joint venture agreements makes sense. And technology companies will tell you that those are real concerns. But I think that that is not going to be what wins the 21st century. What's going to win the 21st century is our focus on the internal innovation development of our country. And the final point I'll say is it's become fashionable to bash China. And I'm very bullish and believe the United States needs to lead the 21st century because of our model of liberal democracy and free enterprise in a way that when reformed should work for everyone. But the bet that we made in the 90s, and there were a lot of mistakes, but the bet we made is, well, millions of people should be lifted out of poverty. That's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that millions of people in other parts of the world are lifted out of poverty. That's something America should champion. And I don't know, maybe there are people in this room who want it. I would think it would be disastrous if the 21st century, if we had another Cold War with China. I mean, do you think human beings, we can evolve with 2 world wars and a Cold War in the 20th century? And now we're thinking of a Cold War with China? I think there can be a better world. So I want America to lead, but I don't want policy that's just going to make conflict inevitable.
I think that's a good point. I want to take it back, I guess, to the personal level a little bit, because we've talked a lot about policy. And do you think that there is with respect to manufacturing, I mean, there tends to be a herd mentality, and a lot of it is also driven by the investment and by Wall Street and quarterly earnings. But in the 90s, it was like, well, we got to source from Mexico, and in the last decade, it's like we got to source from China. And do we have to overcome, in addition to some of the policy responses that you've mentioned, is there some sort of a culture or a mindset that we need to change at the CEO level, at the MBA level, in order to get more of the value back into the United States? And what does that take?
Yes, I mean, I think what happens is that something becomes standard, and then it's easier to just do what everyone else is doing rather than to push to try something different. And especially when some things have legacy costs. So when you make your supply chains, if you start sourcing from China or other places, it becomes very difficult to switch that rather than to start afresh with a new model. And so I think what we ought to emphasize to new business leaders with the research is that there are a lot of advantages to making things in the United States. Not everything, but many things. The advantages are the time it takes to bring something to market. The last mile manufacturing is often done in the United States because of the cost of assembly and transportation. You can save a lot if you're doing that in the United States. Niche manufacturing, where you have particular customer needs and you have to really go back and forth with customers, that can be done in the United States. There's advantage in the talent at some of these research universities if you have an ecosystem to be doing in the United States. So I do think that there's been greater thinking and greater experience about the downsides of just offshoring everything. And that is something that some of the new business leaders and new companies can pioneer. I will tell you, it's my personal opinion, and I'll try not to be very political, but having the President of the United States yell at the GM CEO on Twitter to create jobs isn't going to move the needle. I mean, how many times has the president yelled at Tim Apple or whatever, Tim Cook and GM CEO? I don't know. I mean, how many new jobs have been created? I get it, it's good politics. But the reality is these folks have global supply chains and shareholders and enormous pressures, and they'll be polite. I mean, I wouldn't want the President of the United States, anyone, to, if I was a CEO coming down on me, they'll be thought polite, but they're not going to be cowered into taking action, let alone if the President of the United States or some politician tells them to. They're going to respond to incentives. And that's probably a good thing. I wouldn't want a country where politicians were dictating exactly how businesses should operate. And so, what could have moved the GM CEO is if we had tax credits for SUVs to be electric, for example. Because the reason she's closing those plants is people want to buy SUVs instead of sedans, or some other incentive that would make it easier for her to make that decision. Or you could look at different types of incentives of what it would take for Apple to hire locally. But I think people are getting smarter in realizing that, yes, we want to have some of this manufacturing in the United States. Yes, we want to create the ecosystems for that. But we need real policy solutions and not just rely on morally lecturing business leaders.
Quick time check, Megan and Scott. We've got 15 minutes left. Your call on how you want the discussion go, whether you want to take questions or Congressman Connor, if he wants to take questions. 15 minutes left before the break.
All right, perfect. Well, we'll huddle on that. But in the meantime, continuing on the discussion of incentives for business to manufacture in America, I want to ask you about, and specifically policy incentives, the role of Congress, and you're on the House Armed Services Committee, the role of legislation in incentivizing businesses to continue to develop fledgling technologies here in the United States. So, the specific example I'm thinking of is low TRL technologies that have been proven not just in the lab, but proven in a minimum viable product. They're still relatively low TRL, say 7 or so. Is there a role of specifically defense procurement and acquisition in supporting the development and continued evolution of these technologies here in America?
Yes. Off the record, I was joking with Senator Sanders. I said, so if you're president, you're going to cut the defense budget. He said, no, we're going to increase it. I said, you're going to increase it? He said, yeah, we're just going to call everything defense and put everything in. The point is that Defense Department, DARPA, and in other areas have extraordinary success in creating innovative technology. And we ought to be funding the innovative technology through that. We ought to be funding it, whether it's Senator Peters' proposal of a National Manufacturing Institute that is going to invest in the leading industries and technologies and have a significant investment in those new technologies. And the reason to fund these is because these are hard bets for the private sector. I mean, they're capital intensive. They may not yield returns for 10, 15, 20 years. And that's where the government has stepped in. Now, I would make sure that some of that investment is regionally distributed, so at least the commercialization or the translation of that into product, so that people don't think that it's all based just in DC or all based in on the coast in Silicon Valley or Boston. But I think that investing in those new technologies and in trying to partner with universities and in cities across the country is the biggest economic opportunity for the United States. And I would tie some of that federal dollar investment to making sure that there was a requirement to develop the manufacturing for that in the United States. I mean, I think it's reasonable if federal tax dollars are going to fund this, that we, at least for 4 or 5 years, be producing that in the United States. And too often, we've had the production of technology take place here, and then we've given it away to Taiwan or to other countries. And people say, well, why did we do that? And again, I think I think it's hard to understand how unipolar the world was post the Cold War. I mean, I don't think we anticipated that these economies would come up and be as competitive as quickly. The good thing about America is we do have a sense of paranoia like Silicon Valley, and I think that paranoia usually kicks in. I mean, imagine how many people anticipated that the Soviets would beat the United States. I think Paul Samuelson wrote a whole textbook on that. And then we had cover article about in Harvard Business Review, Japan and Germany are going to be the post-Cold War economies. People usually lose when they bet against America. I'm not saying that out of some sort of grandiose sense that America has everything right, but our biggest challenge is just focus, and I think the skepticism is healthy, and hopefully it'll now move towards rational policy in the Congress and the presidency to prepare us for the 21st century.
So I just had one final question along those lines about not betting against America, even if there's reason to be skeptical. I mean, I think for a lot of people there are plenty of reasons to be skeptical about the political system right now. It seems that the Senate is content with confirming, conservative justices. The administration is kind of a wild card. There's a lot of legislation that can be initiated in the House of Representatives. There's no guarantee it's going to go anywhere. We heard Senator Rubio talk about manufacturing. You hear the president and his cabinet officials talk about manufacturing. You're talking about manufacturing. It seems to be a priority for many Democrats. But what can get done? Or does it take some sort of another sea change?
A lot could get done. I mean, I don't want to put all of this on the president, but the country, ultimately, the president has the largest microphone, not just this president, any president, and sets the conversation. And if the president, I have often said the president really hasn't forced me to cast hard votes, but if the president were to put forward a bill on funding for infrastructure, funding for high-speed internet, funding for manufacturing institutes, funding for increasing R&D spending on advanced technologies, funding even in places and states that he won that would fund technology, I would certainly support it. I mean, I think there would be bipartisan support for those kind of policies. And the hope is that we could come together on issues of American competitiveness. I do think, look, the politics in this country are difficult because what we're trying to do in this country is very difficult. In the history of this country, in the history of the world, there hasn't been a multicultural, multiracial democracy. And so to think that when we're going through a technology revolution and globalization, and that we're trying to emerge as a democracy with people literally from all over the world, and thinking that that would be easy, I think it is perhaps too optimistic. Of course it's going to be a challenge. If it were easy, some other nation would have done it. I think that explains so much of our polarization in politics. But what we should do is look for the common denominator, which is that America should win. I said this to a friend, a Republican. I said, let's not debate climate change. Obviously, I think it's a huge issue. You may think it's not as existential an issue. Is there a single American in this country who believes that China should lead in the industries of the future? I mean, I don't care what the industry is. Most Americans will say, no, we should lead. So the next president should simply say, our goal is very simple. By the end of my next term, we will beat China when it comes to electric vehicles or solar or wind. We're going to make sure that America is number one. And I think there are ways of framing this that will rally across party.
Great. Maybe I'll ask one more question just in time to give the audience a moment. If you guys have questions, I think we should be able to fit in, one or two. So put your thinking caps on. If you've got particular questions, have them at the ready. I wanted to ask one more question, kind of following up on the discussion of a multicultural revolution here in America. So our district, the 17th district of California, is the only majority Asian district in the continental United States, which I learned from your website. And by the way, congratulations last month on your office's award, the 2019 Democracy Award for Excellence in Constituent Services. So they received that award out of all 435 offices. So thank you so much. And all the regional town halls that you've held have been great. I've had a chance to attend a couple of them, so thank you. Thinking about immigration policy for supporting these high-tech industries, I'm curious if you see movement forward in that regard, and not just at the highest, at the highest level of of academic training, but really at all levels in the manufacturing ecosystem. We need skilled workers at so many different levels. I'm curious if you see any movement there. I feel like there's certainly bipartisan agreement around very, highly skilled workers that come and perhaps do their PhDs in STEM here in America and thinking about paths forward to citizenship. But what about all of the other STEM workers at a variety of levels that we still need in this country when you think about the skills gap, the jobs gap in manufacturing?
Well, I think it's a very difficult issue on immigration. I think it's one of the things that has really divided the nation and probably explains more than any other issue Trump's election. And I think what we need is a thoughtful policy forward. We need to understand that it is in America's interest to have certainly people who are finishing school here, who we're subsidizing, or finishing who are bringing extraordinary value to the economy to contribute in the United States instead of outsourcing jobs. On the other hand, I do think we also have to acknowledge some of the abuse of some of these programs. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the H-1B visa program by pure outsourcing companies has led to labor arbitrage where they've been replacing workers for lower costs instead of really using talent. And that, I think, has left a bad taste in people's mouth. And so we need to reform, I think, the places where there's been abuse. And we need to invest in this country in making sure that people have a pathway to those jobs. I mean, consider robotics processing automation. Basically, it's, if you've ordered DoorDash and you're chatting with someone on DoorDash, and the person is likely not another human being on the other end. It's some bot or computer answering your initial questions. That is a company that is located. A lot of those companies that do robotics process automation are in the United States, in my district. Now, if we don't develop the people to help do the robotic process automation, all of that will be offshored. But that doesn't require high skill. It takes maybe 6 months to 9 months of training. And the question is the United States going to do that? And are we going to do that in communities across the United States? If we just don't do that, and then 3 years later, these companies say, well, we need to use visas to bring them in, you can see why people would be resentful. And there's a lot of work like that where people say, why is that gone offshore? It doesn't take a rocket scientist. That's stuff we could do. But there was systematic neglect. And so I think it has to be coupled with a real investment in pathways in this country and communities left behind. The final point I'll make is, and I believe, of course, very deeply that we need far more humane immigration policies and a recognition of our rights. But my parents came from India in the 1960s. They talked a lot more about my responsibilities than my rights. I was born in Philadelphia. They said, you're born an American, don't mess it up. Go work hard, go make something of yourself, learn about this country, learn about your history, learn about what it means to participate. And we have to, I think, speak about what the common American project is going to be. What is our obligation to the nation, to understanding basic history, to understanding the responsibilities of citizenship, so that people see immigration as the rich heritage it is that's going to enrich the American story, not subtract from that story.
So per Megan's point, any questions, comments? Bring the mic over for you here. So this one first. And we're seeing some great patterns about how we need to invest. We have courage to think longer term. Stand up, introduce yourself first.
Hello, my name is Nicholas, and so I've only been in the advanced manufacturing culture for a few weeks, but I've already noticed some very strong patterns, and that is the most commonly cited success stories that hail our glory days of manufacturing are World War II and especially the space race. These times that identify America is having this huge adversary, mobilizing our workforce in order to compete with something that threatens our dominance, our international dominance, and the values that we care about spreading globally. And now we have not only people in this culture, but also people like politicians who are talking about China and how China's rising and how we should probably be afraid of China. And yet we're not seeing the same sort of mobilization that we saw these times during the space race or World War II. And yet you also cited how, you know, there's reason to be afraid of China, but you want to discourage us reaching the point where we make conflict, where we make kind of the disastrous conflict that was World War II or the Cold War. So where do we find that balance where the precedent to our success is identifying a strong adversary on like kind of the global world, but also avoiding the conflicts of the past?
Great, thank you, Nicholas.
It's a great question.
Who had their hand up over here?
You know, we probably need to have someone like George Shultz or some great American statespeople. I think that we can talk about our economic competitiveness, about America leading in innovation, be realistic that we do face strong global competition, that there is a real race between us and China in terms of what model is going to succeed for the rest of the world, and that we want a model that encourages entrepreneurship, innovation, freedom of inquiry, a lot of the things that most Americans believe in, and that is not the model that China represents, and use that as a rallying cry while still having policies that allow it, when necessary, cooperation, whether it's to fight global poverty or climate change or other issues, and try to avoid the creation of a Cold War. And I don't think, and I'm not saying this as a criticism of the president, I don't think anyone in the United States yet has figured out the appropriate policy towards China, of how we can be appropriately tough and competitive and yet not replicate a scenario of a Cold War. I think that's going to be one of the big challenges for the next generation of political leaders and diplomats.
All right, we're out of time. Round of applause for Megan and Scott and for Congressman Conrad.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.